This presentation was recorded at MVCConf. For more content like this, go to www.mvcconf.com. JetBrains, the leading vendor of professional development tools, now offers a range of new products for .NET developers. In addition to ReSharper, the top-class productivity extension for Visual Studio, you can now use .cover to run coverage analysis for your applications, .trace to find performance bottlenecks, and use TeamCity and UTrack for a perfect combination of continuous integration and issue tracking software. Go to www.jetbrains.com for more information.
Our speaker today is David Ebba, who is an architect with the ASP.NET team, talking about T4MVC.
So hi everyone, and so this talk of course was supposed to be on T4MVC exclusively. Unfortunately, the previous session about Razor View Engine was cancelled because we had a bit of a confusion about the speaker. What I'd like to do here is start by doing maybe 15-20 minutes on the Razor View Engine before jumping into T4MVC, just so we get coverage for both technologies, because Razor is pretty interesting in and of itself. So, yeah, Razor View Engine. Razor itself is sort of a general templating engine which can be applied to many contexts. So it is sort of comparable to ASPX format. It's also comparable to something like T4. And really the important thing to understand about Razor is that it's not attached to doing web matrix style web pages or to doing MVC or to doing other things. It's really just a fairly generic templating syntax. Because I've seen around some amount of confusion, because obviously we recently announced web matrix, and that came with the Razor View Engine, and people are looking at those pages and trying to understand, how does that work with MVC? Does it mean I'm going to have all my code that's directly inside the page? And the answer is not at all. Really, the way Razor is used in the context of MVC is extremely similar to the way Razor is used, to the way ASPX is used in MVC, which means you do views where all the code is going to be in the controller, and your views only contain view logic. So what's interesting about Razor View Engine is that it has a syntax which is really good. It's optimized for mixing code and HTML. So if you look at something like ASPX, whenever you want to write code, you have to do those less than % blocks, and it often gets a little bit ugly. Like, for instance, if you have an if statement or a for loop, you need to have this less than % at the beginning, and then you need to close it at the end. While in Razor, we've optimized the syntax to optimize really the transition between HTML and code. So I'm going to create a new project. I have the preview of MVC3 installed here, and I'm going to select a project that says an MVC3 app with Razor syntax, which is a new template. Skip the unit test here. And I'll just start out by compiling it and running it, and it's going to look basically identical to what a MVC app looks today. Here it is. So now let's take a look at what we have in the view. If I right-click here and say go to view, what we see is that this is not an ASPX view. It's now a CS HTML view. And if we go to the Solution Explorer and look on the views, we'll see that this default MVC app that comes when you create your new template is all CS_HTML file. Functionally, it is equivalent to the default app using ASPX. So now let's take a look at the kind of things that we can do with CS_HTML. So let's go back to the controller, and let's start, say, abusing this about action. And let's say that we're going to pass some data to it. So let's pass a few strings. So that's just some quick and dirty view model for, what did I mess up? Yes, one too many. Okay. And now let's make use of that in the view, which lets us sort of show off what the Razor syntax is like. So here, I'm within the context of HTML. And now I'd like to start writing a for loop. Well, first, let's put some li tags or UL tags to wrap the whole thing. And now I'd like to do a for loop. So in ASPX, obviously, you would do something like this, and you'd have your for loop. And then the end of the loop would also be wrapped. You'd have the closing brace like that. The way it works in Razor is much, much simpler. All you have to do is for, and then you directly write your C# code. So let's do var s in model. I think I need to cast model to a string array here. And now I do an opening brace. And the amazing thing here is that if I go to the next line, I can directly have HTML markup without having to close the code context. So here I can write list item. Let's just do the empty list item first, and then close this. So now how can we display our string within that? Again, very, very simple. I just need to do @s. So let's try to run this and see how that works. Anyway, so this is a very simple example, but if you compare what I'm writing here with what I would be writing with the ASPX, it is notably simpler. So now let's see what happens if one of those strings contains HTML here. And we see that the HTML gets properly encoded. So the default behavior when you have some string is to encode it. However, there is enough smart in the system to know that in the context of when you want to run the thing that should not be encoded, it doesn't get encoded. That works through a special return type. In fact, it's very similar to less than %: that we added to ASPX syntax in 2010. So the next thing I'd like to briefly look at here is the concept of layout page. So here, if you look at the top of this view, we see that the layout page is being set to something. And let's go take a look at what it's like. So here we have layout.cshtml. And this is very much a standard CSHTML file. So first of all, as you notice, it has the same extension as the page, unlike ASPX, where this would be a .master page. And what we have here is that it's really a standard page, except somewhere in there is this call to render body. And all that means is at this position here, render the body of the endpoint page that's using this. So and if you look at this page, what's really nice is that unlike what you would have in an ASPX page that uses a master page, this code here is still top level. You don't have to have all those content placeholder section and all those things that tend to move the whole layout and basically add a lot of mess to your file. You really pretty much keep the essence of your file. And you basically, the fact that it's used as an endpoint page is just conveyed by the fact that you're choosing a layout page. So now one question that should come to mind is what happens if you have multiple sections in your layout. So what we can do here is, suppose in addition to the main body, there's some random other thing we want to render, and here I'll make a call to render section. So first, a quick note, as you can see, this is just a plain text editor at this point because we don't have any of the IntelliSense hooked up in VS. This is something that will come, of course, at some point. Right now, it's still very early on, so I'm pretty much typing Notepad style here. And I'll just call render section blah here. So, of course, if I refresh now, it should fail, telling me that, section blah is not defined. So what does it mean to define this section? If I go back to my page, what I can do, so what we have here is the main body, which doesn't have to be wrapped in anything. But I can say here, at section blah, and here I can say, okay, some blah content from the page. If I run it now, we see this coming up here. So it's sort of, it really has all the power that we had in the old .master syntax while keeping the core scenario much cleaner. So the idea is that it's very easy to start from a regular CSHTML page that doesn't use a layout page to suddenly saying, oh, I want a layout page. I'm just going to add this, and I don't have to wrap all my markup and stuff, and then I can deal with extra sections individually.
Hey, David, I have a couple questions in the queue if you can are specific to Razor, if you get time to answer them.
Yes.
One of them can you use generics to specify the model type in the inherits, or is that functionality coming later on?
Well, it's definitely the plan to allow it. Whether it's working right now, I'm not absolutely sure because I sort of installed this MVC 3 bits. Brad Wilson would certainly know. So if you can hear from him, I'm sure he will confirm. But the plan is definitely that it will work. Cool.
He just confirmed, and he says it is there right now. So yes, you could do the syntax. And I'm guessing you can probably check Brad or Andrew's blog to find out more about that. Also, there's another question here. Says, does the at symbol apply to the line? So I couldn't have the opening brace on its own line. So
you absolutely could. Yeah. I could do this. It would make no difference
whatsoever.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So
I mean, really, what happens when you have an at sign? I mean, this is at for each, which it recognizes as something special. And then it's basically going to go until it finds the brace, after which it moves to that other context. Although it doesn't have to, technically you can also have like code. I could say int n equal 5 here, and it continues to work. So it has the smarts to continue being in code mode until it detects something that it says, oh, that looks like a tag. Let's switch to tag mode. And then it balances the tag. So you see, oh, the li is now closed. Like if I was to misspell this thing, it would probably give me some kind of error, or the li element was not closed.
Okay,
so
perfect.
This Razor parser is, it has some smart about the C# language and some smart about the HTML language. It is far from being a complete parser of those two languages, but it basically just knows enough to be able to do the proper context switching with minimal pain.
Sure. There's one that just kind of creeped in here asking does Razor support HTML5?
Well, that should be sort of a non-issue. I mean, a Razor file at its root is really just, you can start with an arbitrary HTML file, and it's sort of like saying that ASPX format support HTML file.
Okay.
HTML5. You start with really whatever file, and then you add code using this syntax.
Okay.
Yep. So the answer is yes, but not because we had to go out of our way to make it work. It just works naturally. One final word I want to say on Razor is again, what I mentioned earlier, do not confuse like just the Razor engine, which is really just the syntactic way of having a template with the particular domains that it's applied to. So meaning as applied to ASP.NET Web Pages or ASP.NET MVC or completely general use. And if you follow Andrew Nurse's blog, he has a lot of very good information. And in fact, last night, I think he blogged on a way to use Razor completely outside of the context of the web, just to do like standard text transformation, just like you would use T4. So now let's switch to T4 MVC. So my talk was titled T4 MVC, the Magic String Killer, just because I thought it was a fun title. And let's talk about first, what am I calling a magic string? So that's a term that maybe means different things to different people, but to me, basically, it means anything in your code, any string in your code that the compiler has no way to check for correctness. So, the obvious examples are when you have a literal string somewhere in your code is just a DOM string to the compiler, no matter what you type in here, it will not fail at compile time. So now, why do we want to kill such magic strings? And that, I think, should be fairly obvious to most. And really, the problem with magic string is that there is no compile time check. Anything that's going to fail is going to fail only much later at runtime, making it much harder to identify issues early. And also, you'll never get anything like refactoring support, again, because the compiler has no idea what those strings are. And finally, they're just ugly. So that's a judgment call, I guess, but I think a lot of people agree on this. So now let's talk about specifically magic strings in the context of MVC. Where do they occur? And the answer is really in a lot of different places. So the first one is whenever you refer to a controller by name, you typically put a literal string. Likewise for action names, view names when you want to render a view, parameter names, so this one is a little bit trickier, and we'll go back to that later, and also static resources. And that's not specific to MVC, but anytime you want to, say, render an image, you have to hard-code as a string the path to that image. So let's show a couple of examples here. The first example is view name. So simplest thing, you have a controller action, and you want to render some view, and you say view, double-quoted, some view. So here, some view is an obvious magic string. If you mistype it, it will not fail until runtime. Now, the bigger example is when you want to refer to a controller an action method. So here, what do we have? Redirect to action. The first parameter here is the name of the action. That's a magic string. The controller name is another one. And then there's a third magic string in here that is not as obvious, and it's not David here. That's not a magic string at all. It's actually this name here, because now we're using this C# anonymous syntax that sort of makes it look like it's a strongly typed thing, when in fact it really isn't. You could type anything in here, and the compiler will not know the difference. So what is T4 MVC? T4 MVC is really just a simple T4 template, which is a .tt file that you can drop in your project, and that starts doing its magic. I guess I shouldn't say it's doing its magic when it's trying to get rid of magic strings, but T4 MVC is an open source project. It's part of MVC Contrib. And basically what it does is that the T4 template generates some code which helps you eliminate magic string. And the other piece I'd like to talk about briefly is a little VS add-in called Chirpy, which is another Codeplex project. And that's a nice little add-in which does multiple things, but one of the things that it does that is relevant to this discussion is that it runs T4 MVC automatically when it needs to run. So such that, say you make a change to your controller and save it, boom, it will regenerate the underlying code to match that. And in addition to that, though it's not directly related to T4 MVC, it does some very nifty thing when it comes to minification of JavaScript files, CSS file, and also the .less files. So if I have time at the end, I'll try to show a small demo of Chirpy as well. So the rest is all demos. So now I'll go back to my VS and create a new project. So same deal, except now instead of Razor syntax, I'll select ASPX. As an aside, T4 MVC does work fine with Razor. Now I'll just show it with ASPX. Okay, so let me just start by running it just to make sure we're clean. Okay. Okay, so let's get started with looking at what magic strings are within the context of this code and how we can fix them. So what we have here is this about action, and I'm going to create a new view, which I'll call my about view it already has a view, obviously, but just for the sake of illustration, I'll create a new one. And I'll tell the controller to render this view. Okay, I compile, run, and if I click About, it works fine. But now, what happens if, for whatever reason, the view, you decided to rename it? So you go under Home, and this becomes my About View 2. I build, and I don't get any errors. Now I run, and sure enough, at runtime, it blows up. So that's a perfect example of a magic string that, the compiler sees this, it has no idea, it's just a literal string, but you only find out that there's a problem at runtime. So now let's see how things work with T4 MVC. So I have in here, so T4 MVC basically is a TT file and a settings.t4 file that comes with it that has some switches that you can change. So I'm just really going to grab those two files, go to the root of my project, and paste them. And that is all I need to do. And the first thing it does is, so that's one small thing you need to be aware of. T4 MVC does make some very small modification to your code. Here, if you notice, this method became virtual, and this class became partial, which really is a harmless thing. Most people don't have a problem with it. I have seen 2 or 3 people that say, well, if it touches my code in any way, I don't want to use it. And that's sort of one thing. If you want to use T4 MVC, you have to accept that it's going to make your controller actions virtual. So now let's see how we can fix this code. Instead of doing this, we'll keep it for reference. I can say view, and I can write views dot my about view 2. And it's 2 because I had renamed it. And as you can see, well, first let's run it to make sure it continues running. Yes. And now, if I decide to say, it's really my about view 3, let's see what happens. Go back to the code, and instantly you get a compile error. So your code will not compile because you have a view that doesn't match. And now I can fix it, view 3, and it's fixed. So that's really the simplest case of benefit of T4 MVC is just view names. So, another thing I want to mention, I mentioned this Chirpy add-in. This is something I do have installed right now. And yes. So if I go to Tools menu, I'm going to show you how to get this add-in. If you go to Extension Manager and Online Gallery and search for Chirpy, you find it here. You can go to more information to go to the specific page. It actually doesn't even mention T4 MVC because they just added this functionality, but they'll change that. So I don't own this Chirpy project. This is owned by some other people that I've been discussing, been talking to. So what this add-in does is it makes it so that normally a T4 template, you will have to right-click on it and say Run Custom Tool anytime you want to re-execute it. If you have the Chirpy add-in, it does that automatically, basically. So it's pretty nice. You essentially don't have to worry about the T4 templates anymore. It just works in the background, does its thing. So now let's create a new controller. So I can go in here, controllers, cool controller, and in here I'll just give it some action. And what we'll do here is really we'll just throw an exception to show that the action was called. Oh, and to make it more interesting, we'll give it a parameter. So say string name. And here we'll just say throw the exception saying that cool.bar was called and it was passed some name. Okay? So now let's go back to this about view, about action, and try to do a redirect to action. So this is something you can do in MVC. You're in one action, decide that you really want to execute a different action, and you do a client redirect. So let's first do it the traditional MVC way. What you would write is something like this. You'd write return redirect to action. The first parameter would be the action name, which here is bar, but we get no IntelliSense. We very well may be typing it wrong. Then we want the controller name. And finally, we want to pass parameters. So let's give some name equal. Okay. So let's go ahead and run this. Oops. And it works. So we see the exception. Okay, cool.bar was called with David being passed in. But now, so if you remember back to my slides, I was showing this kind of expression and explaining that really there are three magic strings here. There is the action name, the controller name, and the parameter name. If you get any of those wrong, you're out of luck. So to give an example here, if I was to say, okay, let's say the parameter is now called name2, and I say, okay, refactor this thing, fine, it's going to rename it here, which is great, but if I rebuild and run, we don't get name passed in because we had hard-coded this guy to be name instead of name2. So now let's do the same thing the T4 MVC way. So again, I'll keep this guy for reference. And here we'll do return redirect to action. And now what we get to write is something that looks like MVC. So uppercase MVC is the prefix that is used for the T4 MVC functionality. And as I say dot, I see the name of my controllers. So I want, oh, cool controller. And then I see my actions, bar, and then I get to directly call it as a method. And I'll put some other names. And here we are. So let's run this. And it works. We get this name Joe. So the first benefit should be, there's really many benefits we've seen already. The first is that it's much more concise and readable because effectively it looks like you're calling your controller action, even though in practice this is not truly making a call to your controller action because that would make no sense. It's just a pseudo call that captures the essence of the call, meaning it captures the fact that it's the controller name cool and the action name bar and the parameters. And obviously I got IntelliSense while typing it. Another big benefit is that if I mistype something, obviously I'll get a compile error. And furthermore, if I decide to rename this action method, so now I want this to be bar 3, and I say, oh, refactor, and name becomes the name 3. Okay, so let's see what happened. We go back to here, and it got renamed as well. So you get refactoring here, and if I run again, well, I'm not sure that, yes, and it keeps on working. So are there any questions up to this point?
Yeah, I was going to ping you about that. We have one on the queue here saying, essentially, here, give me 1 second so I can read it better. At what point does the T4 template run? Every time you create anything new or on existing files? So at what point does Visual Studio kick that out? Is just any changes? Is it immediate or is it save?
So that kind of goes back to this Chirpy add-in that I installed. So without the add-in, the template would not run automatically, and you would have to basically say, right-click on it and say run custom tool. Either that or you could open the TT file and manually save it, which causes it to re-execute. With the add-in, it re-executes the template, I believe, every time you save the file. They have some smart in there to try to optimize exactly when it runs.
Sure.
I did not write this add-in myself, so I'm not sure exactly what the heuristic is, but it appears to work pretty well and run when it should.
Okay, so once it runs, I'm guessing it's generating some source, right? So
Absolutely. So yes. I didn't show you any of that, but if you look under this TT file, you'll see a bunch of things getting generated. So actually, let's go back to like what we had initially. Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned that. If I say views about what we started out with, if you look at that, somewhere in there you see, oh yes, it generated something that has the full path to the view. And likewise, well, if I say go to definition from this one, it will actually go to the real definition because I figured from this one here, this will go to your real action method. So it looks like it's calling that one, but underneath the cover, it's really calling an override of that method that lives somewhere in here. So we have this generated file, and if you look deep in there, you'll see some class that extends your controller right here, and that overrides the action method and does all kind of funky things, which you can certainly look at if you're interested, but you generally don't need to. And by the way, the fact that it needs to override that method obviously is the reason why it had to make the method virtual.
Right. The one question that somebody was asking here was in regards to, say, these files are in source control. Have you had any issues with that? Sort of like checking it out if it's locked, or is it pretty much depending on the settings that you have?
Well, I guess it depends what source control you're using. If you're using something like Mercurial, which typically doesn't lock file, it will just modify whatever it modifies. And then when you look at your diff, if something changed, you'll see that the file is changed. If you're using something like TFS, which typically does lock the files, assuming you have the TFS integration in Visual Studio, those files will get checked out. So you'll see in your file, in the list of files checked out, you may see some of those guys. And of course, you have to check them in. They are now part of your project.
Cool. Another question here is that you're talking about the IntelliSense, especially in the controller part. It's like, does that work in the view also?
Yes. It works with absolutely. And I will get to that. Actually, that's my next thing. Actually, well, yeah, one last thing I wanted to show is that sometimes, so here it's doing like this pseudo call to the controller action, but sometimes you need to get individually just the action name. And you could do this by saying MVC dot cool dot action names and bar 3. And this will basically evaluate to a string which just has bar 3. And likewise, you could say cool dot name, and this will evaluate to just the controller name. So yeah, I could have rewritten this original MVC call and just changed this bar and this cool by the two things I just showed, and that would have been sort of functionally equivalent, except for the parameter. But it just would have looked really ugly. But for cases where you do need the action name and controller name individually, T4 MVC does make that available. Now, let's see what happens within the view. Am I on time? 12:40. So, yeah. Let's go to this index view here. And let's try to do a redirect. Let's try to do an action link in here. So let's first do it the traditional way. So you would do something like HTML.actionLink, and then you'd say something like ICME, and you would first have to have, I believe it's the action name, followed by the controller name. So it's pretty similar to the call to redirect the to action, which I showed within the controller. And here I can pass some parameters. So I can say, okay, name, was it still called, it might have been called name 2, but we'll fix that. Name equal ABC. And I think I need to pass null for the HTML attributes. Okay, so let me quickly check, get the name back to what it should be. Okay, and let's go ahead and run this. So we have this new link, and cool/bar. Oh, sorry, yes, I had renamed this guy as well. Okay. And now it works. So, in fact, I didn't really mean to, but while I was typing the code, I sort of demonstrated the problem with magic string, that I got 2 of them wrong. So let me clean that a little bit so you can see better. And now, let's see what this would look like with T4MVC. So T4MVC basically has that pattern where you make the call the same way that we had seen in the controller, where you write mvc.cool.bar, like you make this pseudo method call. That's something that occurs in many places in T4MVC. So here it's going to be very similar, except we still call action link. The first parameter, of course, is just the display string, so that has to stay the same. But what comes next, I get to say mvc dot cool dot bar. Okay. And now let's see what happens here. And we get our call. So again, comparing this mess to what we have here, this is type safe, you get IntelliSense, you get compile time checking, the whole deal. An interesting question is also, what if I want, because if you look at the parameters that are being passed to the action method, here it's limited to the fact that, okay, bar takes this name thing. But what if I wanted to pass something that is not captured as a parameter to the action method? So the way you would do it here, obviously, would be very natural. You would just say foo equal 1, something like that. The way it works in T4MVC is that there is a fluent interface on those calls where you get to say something like, you make this call and you can say dot add route value, and here I can say foo 1. So obviously there's no IntelliSense on this foo because it has no equivalent in the code. So this is intrinsically a magic string at this point, but this just shows you how to achieve the same thing. So refreshing this, if I click here, you can see that we got this extra foo equal 1 getting passed in. If you wanted multiple of them, you could say add route values. Well, first, since it's a fluent interface, you could make multiple calls to add route value. But if you have too many, you may be better off saying add route values, and then you could pass an anonymous object here. Equal 1. Okay. And here we are. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was routing. So suppose, let's go to our global.ASAX where routing tends to be. And let's say we want to have a special route for our cool bar action. So I'll start by copying this line, and here I can say, let me give it some name. This is just the name of the route, and then let's come up with some random route that we can recognize. My super cool route. Oh, and let's get the name somewhere in there. Okay. And now, so far I have not used T4MVC, but if I want to use it, I get rid of those parameters here, and instead I write exactly the same thing that we've now seen in 2 places. I write here mvc.cool.bar, except with one small difference is that here I don't want to convey a value for the parameter because the parameter is going to come from the routes. So instead of passing a string, I call an overload that doesn't take a string. And let's see how that works. And here we are. If you look at the URL, we've got MySuperCoolRoute, BBB gets passed in the URL, that was the name, and then these extra parameters that we had in there. Okay. Any questions on this, Javier? Okay. So now, oh yes, the last thing I want to show in terms of magic string that we haven't looked at is static files. So let's add a static file to here on the content. I think I had one. Yes, I stole the MVC Contrib logo, and I'm going to dump it in content here. Okay, and now I'm in my index view, and suppose I want to render this. So normally you would basically have your image source equal, and then you would have a string that points to the specific image that you want. With T4 MVC, we instead get some strong type code that you can use to point to your images and other static resources. Unfortunately, Visual Studio doesn't support IntelliSense within attributes, so one thing you can do is type it outside of it. So I can type links. So links is a T4 MVC generated thing, .content, .mvcconfig.jpg. And now I can take this chunk, put it here, and I should be good to go. Or not, maybe I didn't build something. Yes. So as you can see here, we got our image rendered. If I get the property on that image, it's pointing straight to the same thing that you would see if you had done it the manual way. Another nice benefit of T4 MVC is that if you look at this settings.t4 file, there are actually a lot of switches you can change to get custom behavior. And one of them that's kind of interesting is to say add timestamp to static link equal true. So let's see what happens if I do this. I think there's a small refresh issue that I need to delete the generated file only in this one case to get it to properly refresh. So let's go ahead and refresh this page and look at the URL again. And now look how there is a query string with some number, and this number is essentially a timestamp for the file. So the really nice thing about that is that whenever you change the file on the server, if you have a new version of the image, automatically it forces browsers to not cache the old thing because the URL is going to be different. So that can be pretty handy. Let's see. And what is my VS? Okay, let me think what I wanted to discuss next. Oh, well, yeah, similarly to if you want to refer to JavaScript files, same deal, links.script. And you'll see everything in there. If you evaluate one of those guys, you'll go straight to something that essentially evaluates to what you would have written.
I have a couple questions here.
Yeah, okay, let's go ahead.
Does T4 MVC change the way we unit test our applications?
No, it really shouldn't make a difference. Because in the end, what gets generated or sent is not fundamentally different from what you would do normally. I mean, when you make this pseudo call, it ends up basically just wrapping all your parameters in the exact same dictionary that would be used. If you step into the generated code, you can kind of see what it's doing, but it's essentially building the same data structures that would normally happen.
Okay. Are there any reasons why you would choose not to use T4 MVC?
Well, I mentioned one reason, if you don't like the fact that it's making your method virtuals. Another reason is it does assume a certain structure to your MVC project because it needs to locate the controllers and locate your views and such. So if you're using a very non-standard structure, it just may not work very well for you. Potentially another issue if you have a very, very large project, it may be that the fact that it regenerates the code when you save a controller might start getting a bit sluggish. There have been some report on very large projects, someone saying it was taking a long time, although I tried to report and couldn't see it myself.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I had one last very small thing before I get to the Sharpie add-in is the new support for areas. So here I can create a new area. So this is an MVC2, not MVC3 thing. And within my area, I can create a controller. Okay, and I just want to show that if I'm here going back to my home controller, I can write the same. That's going to look like MVC dot. Didn't refresh. Okay. MVC dot my area dot ZZ dot index. So essentially, it has support for areas by just adding an extra token to this path or to this expression.
Okay.
So let's get into this Chirpy add-in. So the idea here is that if you have, let's go into our script files, and let's create. Let me start by copying this. And let's create a file called foo.chirp.js. So this is a special naming that they recognize, and let me open it and let's write some random code. Okay, when I save this file, automatically under it, you'll see a foo.min.js get generated, which is the minified version of the file. So it's a very convenient way of automatically minifying all your files. And if you go on the Tools option Chirp, they actually support various types of compressor. There is the Yahoo compressor. There is various Google Closure things. And another nice thing that it does is that suppose I have a syntax error. So I think I'm writing C#. Boom. I get directly in here an error, which I would not normally get. So it does all kind of syntax checking on your JavaScript. So again, it goes in the direction of catching issues earlier. Another nice thing that it does, it has support for the .less files. So let's create a new, I guess I'll make it a text file, and I'll call it whatever, .chirp.less. And here I've just copied some little piece of less that I got on the less website. So the thing about less is that it avoids replicating strings. So normally you could not write that in CSS, but here we have this color that is set once and is used in two different places. And if I go here and I look at my less file, what got generated on there is a CSS file equivalent. So it basically processed it as well as a minified version of that same thing. So very, very convenient little add-in that you may want to give a try to. So to install it, just go to the, as I showed earlier, the Tools Extension Manager and just search for Chirpy. So I think I'll leave the last 4 minutes to any question that may come up.
Someone was asking about Razor and why would you want to use it instead of something like Spark or Enamel?
Well, it really comes down to choice. I mean, each syntax offers something a little bit different. So, and the way I look at it, Spark is really great if you want to be very tag-oriented. So in Spark, if you want to have a for loop, that for loop or if statement is going to be captured inside an HTML tag. So you end up with code that is much more sort of XHTML compliant. In the case of Razor, like I said, let me go back to the previous project so I can there was this one. It just takes a totally different philosophy. That it doesn't try to do code as markup, but instead it focuses on having nice transition between code and markup. So, I mean, I don't think there's any wrong and right. Like Spark is great. This is really just one more option, and it just comes down. You have to look at what they each offer and decide which one you prefer to use. In the end, I mean, they're both fully functional MVC engines, and you will get your work done with either one.
Right. Thank you very much, David.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This presentation was recorded at MVCConf. For more content like this, go to www.mvcconf.com.